Hello, and welcome to this podcast. Today I'm going to read you 3 chapters from my book, The Talmud and Occultist Introduction. It's a little bit of a niche topic and not immediately applicable to any occult practice. This is definitely more of an informational book, but I think you'll enjoy it. Today I will read the introduction, my personal exposure to the Talmud, and an excerpt of one chapter called The History and Makeup of the Talmud. I did not read the whole chapter because that is the longest chapter, and we would be here probably for a good half an hour, 45 minutes if I did. But I think you'll get a lot of information. I hope you enjoy it. Introduction. The Talmud is by far the most important set of books in the Jewish faith, aside from the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament. In many ways, the Talmud may even surpass it in importance. I say this because if the Talmud did not exist, the laws that are written in the Torah would not make any sense. So in this way, it is like a Jewish canon law. Just like Catholic canon law explains biblical texts of the Bible, so too does the Talmud. It does not only explain laws, of course, but it goes into great depth on many other topics as well. While this book will serve as a general introduction, I'm gearing this book more towards those that have an occult leaning. I do this because of several requests I have received to do so. Most books on the Talmud are written with an implied understanding that the reader is either Jewish or has some knowledge of Hebrew and Aramaic, even if rudimentary. I find this to be exclusionary to everyone, especially the Western practicing occultists. I also gear this book towards occultists because the Talmud itself has several instances of magic that I feel are quite interesting. I will mention a few in this book. Though there'll be no rituals at the end of the book, I think as an occultist you will gain great understanding of these texts. In this book I will cover the following: my experience with the Talmud, the history and makeup of the Talmud, the context in which it was written and compiled, the language used in the Talmud. It's not only Hebrew, by the way. Example of Torah law elucidation. The mention of Jesus in the Talmud's view on non-Jewish people. Occultism and magic in the Talmud. And finally, some miscellaneous oddities of the Talmud. I hope you enjoy it. My experience with the Talmud. There is no set of texts more difficult than the Talmud in Jewish tradition, at least in my estimation. Some say the Zohar, the foundational text of the Kabbalah, is harder, but I find the Talmud to be much more difficult. To be fair, it is mostly legalese couched in convoluted narrative, so this adds to the intimidation one might feel when approaching it. It also doesn't help that it is voluminous, with 63 books in total. It can fit the Zohar's 23 volumes into it nearly 3 times over. In either case, it is a foundational text, and Jewish law as we know it would not make any sense if the Talmud didn't exist. I would like to say that although I'm referring to the Talmud as a single text, it is not, as I indicated above, and I will get into that in the next chapter. However, for the sake of simplicity, I will often refer to it as a single text going forward. I was first exposed to the Talmud at an early age, not only because my father's side is of Sephardic heritage, but also because my father sent me to Jewish schools at times. Most of the schools were not super strict or religious. My father was not religious at all, but he once tried to send me to an Orthodox school to fix me up. But that failed. I was kicked out within a few weeks. They said that I was not a good fit. I wasn't. But that's for another time. It's a funny story, though. Maybe in the future, in a podcast or something, I will address it. So having been to schools that had a Jewish bent to them in my early years, I learned about all the Jewish traditions. Some of these traditions came right out of the Talmud, although you would never know it since the teachers never mentioned the Talmud directly. They tended to stick to the Old Testament in general. I suspect this was because the school wasn't religious, and secondly, it was not so easy to explain the concept to a mostly secular bunch of kids with parents with only a smattering of Jewish tendencies. They knew none of us were going to be teachers or rabbis in the future. It was only after I inquired with the teacher did she tell me where some of these traditions come from. At the time, I understood it as a kind of parallel Torah. The term oral Torah was bandied about a lot, so in a sense it was very much a parallel Torah. Fast forward to the 90s with my Jewish roots way behind me and my occult practice in full force. I started to study the Kabbalah with renewed vigor. It was then when the topic of the Talmud came up again. I splurged and bought the entire Talmud, both versions, and started to make my way through some of it. This was before ebooks, so they were bulky and expensive. I started to become familiar with the Talmud's structure and its language, mostly Aramaic. My neighbor, who sadly passed 2 years ago, was a teacher of Orthodox Judaism. I knew her since birth. We shared a common heritage. She was from Yemen, as was my paternal grandmother. She taught me a lot, even though she knew I was far from Judaism as could be. Her lessons helped a lot in understanding the Talmud. One thing that surprised me was that magic was being performed in it as well. Real magic by actual rabbis, not just Gentile heathen sorcerers. This intrigued me, and I delved as deeply as I could. I must say, despite it being a taxing endeavor to even read a few pages of it, it does contain many secrets and many interesting things. The history and makeup of the Talmud. I would like to apologize up front for the length of this chapter, since this is a complex topic. I wanted to make sure I covered as much as I could without overdoing it. Although this is a condensed history, it is still quite long. The word Talmud simply means study or learning. The Talmud, as I stated, is not a single text but a compilation of texts. Its structure is fairly straightforward. The main text is called the Mishnah, or as it is called, the Oral Torah. The Mishnah is a text that elucidates on most of the Jewish practice, also serves as a kind of philosophical backbone to Judaism. Its main purpose is to serve as an interpretation of biblical law. It itself needs further elucidation, which is provided in another set of texts called the Gemara. The Gemara are rabbinical explanations on the Mishnah. Together they form the Talmud. The Mishnah itself was compiled around 200 AD, and the first Gemara was to form about 200 years later. Aside from the Talmud being many volumes in length, it is also split into two fairly distinctive bodies of work. We have the Talmud written in Israel proper, often called the Talmud Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem Talmud, also sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud, in 400 AD or so. This was the first Talmud to be compiled. The second one was compiled in quote-unquote Babylon, modern-day Iraq, around 600 AD. It is most commonly called the Talmud Bavli, or simply the Babylonian Talmud. There was a very large Jewish community in Baghdad at the time of its compilation. Both Talmudic versions are considered holy and valid. However, if they do not agree on a certain explanation or implementation of a law, the Babylonian Talmud takes precedence. This is due in part to the fact it is considered to be more complete and has much more information than the Jerusalem Talmud does. In addition, the Babylonian Jews were wealthier and had the resources which allowed them to study Torah in more depth and facilitate schools in which Torah study could take place. Since this is the case, when you hear the Talmud quoted or referenced, I can assure you 100% they are referring to the Babylonian Talmud. As I mentioned earlier, the Mishnah is considered the Oral Torah, but since the entire Talmud revolves around the Mishnah, the term Talmud is often the catch-all term for the Oral Torah. In religious communities, the word Shas is also used to refer to the Talmud. Going forward, when I mention Oral Torah, I will be referring to the Talmud as a whole. That is, unless I need to be more specific about an idea or concept in which specificity will be warranted. Since the Talmud is the Oral Torah, in Jewish tradition it is inextricably linked to the revealed Torah we have in the Old Testament. Judaism cannot be clearly understood without the Talmud, and therefore it must be considered just one aspect of the Torah itself. There are groups who disavow the validity of the Talmud, such as the Karaites, but they are in the minority. Legend has it that when the Torah was revealed on Mount Sinai, it came in two forms, written and oral, thus written Torah and oral Torah. There is of course no proof that there was an oral Torah that was transmitted through memory, but custom and tradition state it is so. Denying this tradition is considered a sin and is just as weighty as denying the validity of the Torah in Orthodox Jewish circles. For the sake of this book, I am not going to argue the validity of this claim. I will simply provide the information to you and you can do more research and decide. Oral traditions are common in many religions, so there is a possibility, of course, that an oral tradition did exist in early Hebraic religion. The dissemination of this oral tradition was thought to be as such: from God to Moses, from Moses to Joshua, from Joshua to the prophets to the sages, and eventually from the sages to the rabbinic authorities who created the Mishnah. If rabbinic sources are correct, the Torah was revealed around 1312 BC, so we are talking a good 1500 or so years that this oral tradition was passing from one person to another. Like all oral traditions, a lot gets added with time. A lot has occurred to the Hebrews from the time of Mount Sinai to 200 AD. 2 major exiles, several near misses with total annihilation, and almost constant infighting, just to name a few things. There is no doubt that if such an oral tradition existed, it is not even remotely resembling what it was at its inception. Of course, this position is considered sacrilegious, but it makes sense. If this chain of transmission is true, the rabbis, also known collectively as the Tanaim, who comprise the Mishnah, are the inheritors of a direct line of transmission from the holiest of all prophets, Moses. Later rabbis called Amoraim took on after the Tanaim, and down the line it went to other classes of rabbis and sages. These great rabbis, as I said, were located both in Israel and Iraq. Because the Babylonian Jews were better off, and they knew it, some rivalries emerged between them and the ones in Israel. Some pretty nasty interactions would occur. Since it is considered a sin for Jews to live outside of Israel, the Babylonian community posed an interesting problem. Some in Israel believed that any Jewish person who returned from Babylon to settle in Israel was considered unfit for marriage. Some Babylonian Jews went so far as to say that because Abraham was from that region, that Babylon was also holy and it was okay for Jews to settle there. There was a lot of resentment between the rabbis of the Jerusalem Talmud and those of the Babylonian ones. If you want to read a terrific book on this very topic, please pick up a copy of the book The Battle of the Two Talmuds by Leo Charney. It is an outstanding read on this subject. As mentioned above, the main goal of the Talmud is to elucidate the contents contained in the Mishnah. However, it also goes way beyond the Mishnah as well. In the text of the Gemara, we find topics that may not be fully expounded upon in the Mishnah, or that are no longer applicable. For example, we find a sharp contrast between the Mishnah and the Gemara on the political structure that should govern Israel. The Mishnah is old school and discusses how the people of Israel should be governed by a king for political reasons and a high priest for spiritual ones. The commentary in the Talmud that is found in the Gemara refutes this arrangement. The reason is not so much because the rabbis are being insolent or disobedient, but rather the rabbis knew that such an arrangement was no longer a viable and realistic option at the time. The reason for this is that the Jewish people during the Talmudic period were not exactly unified, nor were they in countries in which they had a lot of stability, although the Iraqi Jews surely had more stability than those in Israel at the time. In light of this, adjustments had to be made to fit the times in which they lived. In regard to the scenario above, the Talmud more or less approved of a patriarchal structure, with lawyers and legal professionals underneath a Rav, or head rabbi. This may seem rather minor, but it is an example that the Gemara is not always about the Mishnah itself, but can break away quite substantially when the situation warrants it. The Talmud, despite its often convoluted language, has a structure that can be gleaned as you work through the text. You have the rabbis asking a question about something found in the Old Testament, and then they try to relate it to other laws of the Bible. At first, this stays within the context of Mishnaic law, but more often than not, ventures way off into other intellectual, spiritual, and occult realms with clear references to magic in some instances. This method comprised the entire process of legal decision-making in the Talmud. This process in Hebrew is called pilpul. As an interesting aside, pilpul is derived from the word pilpel, which means pepper. This is meant to illustrate the intensity and sharpness of Talmudic discourse. Believe me, it can get mind-numbing. As I illustrated earlier, the Talmuds revolve around the Mishnah, but that does not mean that they are in any way homogeneous. On the surface, both Talmuds expound on the Mishnah in the same order, but they do so in very different ways and in many instances using different ideas and linguistic conventions. The two versions of the Talmud will and do operate autonomously from one another. The Babylonian Talmud is far more extensive, and in the end is probably a better place to start if you decide to explore the Talmud for yourself. Now let us look at the different sections of the Talmud as a whole. There you have it, my friends. Thank you for listening to this podcast. I know it was a little bit of a niche topic and may not be applicable to many people, but it's informational and it's interesting. I find that other books on this topic tend to get a little too heavy, so I tried my best to make it as easy as possible, and that's really my forte, and I tried to do that with this book as well. If you are interested in the book, it's called The Talmud and Occultist Introduction and can be found on Amazon and Kindle and paperback. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I will speak to you soon. So mote it be.